very good day to you and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I have an enormous pleasure to introduce to you a very distinguished panel, starting with my very good friend Vladimir Milov, who flew in not from Moscow but from the Black Sea, which is a very good indicator that not only the Kremlin guys are visiting our Black Sea coast, but the other Russia or the opposition also has a free time to spend on the Black Sea instead of organizing rallies.
Can you speak on the microphone?
Okay, and organizing rallies throughout the country. To my right is Yulia Zhukova. I came to know her via Vladimir Nemtsov, and they're very close partners, and I relied heavily on her to represent the picture of the economy of present-day Russia, so that we can dissect from it what might come in terms of economic determinants. And to my left is Alex. You know Alex. He's the bosso, the grande bosso of the Bulgaria Analytica and of the Center for Balkan and Black Sea Studies. He would also join in with a very interesting presentation on the military side of budgets and the military determinants of what the future would spell for Russia. And Vasko Nachev would give a very short brief on the global trends on oil and gas prices, which for Russia, when you start dissecting or trying to understand what would befall upon Russia, then oil and gas come naturally. If you can learn the trends of oil and gas in the future, you would learn a lot. Vlad has been very instrumental in, very active in recent news coming from Russian opposition. As you know, there are very interesting things happening in Russia at the present moment. If people are just watching, very few of those, of course, you would find in the news feed and the news on the central TV. But there's something happening in Russia, because you have rallies in Archangels, in Ekaterinburg, or in the major cities, and you see a lot of people turning out. And that is a very interesting phenomenon. The second reason I believe that it is very important to have people from the opposition and the sort of the non-close to Kremlin people is that Bulgarian-Russian relations in the last 10 or 15 years have evolved, and at present they are confined to relations only on official level, the formal level. And that is very, very detrimental to their future, because you don't expect people to all the full bloodstream of those relations to be defined just by a few bureaucrats at the top or few politicians at the top. Just to give you one example, few people know how many Bulgarians visit Russia each and every year. And in my days, it was something to the tune of 12,000 up to 15,000. You can't expect with 15,000 people to have a full-bodied relationship. So there's something basically wrong. And this part of, on the other side, you have, of course, 300,000 tourists. But this is a natural. So, but it's not the thing that should determine a flow, and also substantive flow of an exchange of people. So if people don't visit a country, in time, they would not only, the language is the less barrier, the language barrier is the less thing that is important, but they don't really understand each other. I asked my Bulgarian fellows how many of you have been to Siberia No, the good way, the good way, not the. And he would rarely see 2 or 3 hands in a room full of people. And if I was, I can't, but if I was someone to advise the Russian government, I would instantly tell them, look, just make this a tourist asset, and you would get more money flying into the Russian state coffers than you would get from the export of oil and gas. Because the natural treasure of this is just incredible. Anyhow, to cut a very a long story short, we start with Vasko Nachev, who would give us a very short, succinct, just a few slides on oil and gas in the world. Then we'll move to Vladimir Milov. He would cover the essential new determinants of the world after Putin. Actually, the world after Putin is starting today. So we're trying to sort of to identify what would determine. Inshallah. Which is the old Bulgarian saying. In Volga, Bulgaria. And then Alex and Yulia would also jump in. Unfortunately, we don't have a Russian translation, but we had to keep the budget very tight, so that's cool.
Thank you, Ilyan. As Ilyan told you, I have a really short presentation about the energy industry and especially oil and gas as a part of energy. By the way, I expected to speak in Russian on this briefing because our guests are from Russian, but Ilyan say no, probably because he has
I forgot my Russian.
not only this, he has some not allowed to visit Russian, probably this is the reason. I don't know. He knows better.
No, I enjoy speaking Russian. It's a great language.
Anyway, so the first slide, I just, this slide is only for, yeah, have to switch off
Could you
the
leave
lamp
the lights?
on the first line. Cannot see anything.
Ah, voilà. Okay.
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. Just this slide only just for orientation. This full consumption by region for the last year. You can see the column 3 is concerning for coal, especially the yellow, green, yellow, yellow color. This the Asia Pacific. You can see how much percentage they are using coal on that region. So green, blue, this is the second from bottom to top. That's Europe, which is not so bad. Typically, green is for North America. Everybody knows that the situation there is very, very good concerning to coal use. So I concentrate only for oil and natural gas, nuclear power and renewables. This another part we don't have enough time to discuss, but for oil and gas, I mentioned coal because, you know, the situation in Maritsa East region, there are a lot of problems there. I think that the Minister of Energy must know this information when they make a decision what they're planning to do in this area. According to American administration for energy, world energy consumption to increase 28% by 2040, which is really a long time period. Is difficult to make some prognosis for that period. But even though, let's see. As I told you, I'm concentrating only for fuel type. And the first point, natural gas, which has a lower carbon intensity than coal and oil. Global gas consumption increasing with 1.4% per year. So we can calculate 25 years how many percent will increase by 2040. The next point is the liquid, which contain oil and oil products like gasoline and diesel. The energy consumption is projected to fall slightly 2%. Can you imagine the next 25 years only 2% less compared to 2015 to 2040? For 25 years only 2%. It's, I think that it's not very optimistic information for renewable, but this is the facts. So the coal, as I mentioned, energy consumption decline with 6% for the next 25 years only. So even 2040, the coal will be on the table for energy consumption. Renewable are expected to be fastest growing, 2.2% per year, which are really very, very optimistic prognosis. I don't believe that it's possible to keep 2.2% every year, maybe from the beginning, but later on. But we'll see, you know, different people, different prognosis. For this chart, I just want to show you the proven oil reserves. You can see the small one is 1996, in the middle is 2006, and the last one is to the right is 2016. So if you open some prognosis, for example, from 1979, you can see that that prognosis was 2000 or 1997, the oil finished completely in the world, but situation is completely different. So all prediction is really difficult to do that because, you know, the situation is very complicated in the world and very often can change from A to Z. So this the data from this morning, WTI, Urals, and Brent. You see 5 to 6 USD per barrel difference between WTI and Brent. Even though the Brent is bad quality compared to WTI, but this $6, that means this the political risk, and you can understand what's going on, especially in Middle East, when you see the prices WTI and Brent. If the margin is bigger than between WTI and Brent, that means there are a lot of political risk on this region. So I don't like to predict approaching of the market peak because almost always deceptive. But as I mentioned, the current state of the oil market forces me to give some forecast. Brent flirted with 60 USD per barrel last week, but there was only one reason for that, and you know, the Kurdistan referendum. This is the result from Kurdistan referendum, because 1 billion barrel per day they sell from Kurdistan place in Iraq. So it was a reason for this this price of Brent, especially. For Urals is also a bad quality compared to WTI, but for Russian is better to be close to Brent instead of WTI. Is 80 USD possible? I don't think so. There is quite a bit disagreement about what happened next with oil price, but very soon, I think maximum week or two ahead, we'll see the price go back to 52, maximum 55 USD per barrel. On this chart, I just want to show you the price for the last 150 years. You can see the first peak, this Pennsylvania oil boom. The next one is Iranian Revolution, and the last one is Arab Spring. So from this chart, we can see how political risk has relation to the price of oil. About natural gas demand by selection region looks especially, let's to concentrate for European Union. This is the fourth column from left to right. Yeah, you can see the prognosis are 0.6% per year increase for Europe. So when you heard for some mega project like Turkish Stream, South Stream, Nord Stream 2, always we have to concentrate of this digit 0.6% per year. So everybody can, every one of us can calculate how many percent will increase the next 25 years, for example. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll give.
Thank you. Now, I pass on the ball now to Vlad to start with the with his presentation. You have a mic, yeah, okay. You have to switch it on. I don't know how. It's working.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm a bit tempted, as an energy sector guy, I'm a bit tempted to comment on the previous presentation. I probably will a bit later, but of course I'm here to deliver a bit broader picture, which I will try to do. And first thing I would strongly advise against when we are speaking about the future of Russia is consider it in the business as usual terms, which unfortunately many Russia watchers, both at home and abroad, used to do these days. We can hear a lot about sky-high Putin's approval ratings, about Putin staying in power forever. If you take a look at the longer retrospective of the Russian history, in the very recent Russian history in the past 25 years, basically there's no such thing as a forever in Russian politics. We do have a tradition of lasting business as usual periods. However, with the well-accommodated system of over-centralized governance that we have built over centuries, it's very clear that disproportions keep multiplying during such relatively calm business as usual times, and at some point they become so severe that the situation explodes. This was basically the history of Russia in the course of the past century. And even in the very recent times, you could have seen that it has not been so calm and quiet as many observers would describe. For instance, just to describe the past decade, we have been through a number of major waypoints, if you will, after which the whole concept and mainstream view about Russian politics have greatly changed. For instance, 10 years ago, when me and Boris Nemtsov were discussing our first report, Putin the Results, which I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with, it was released, the first version of it, where we critically assessed two first presidential terms of Vladimir Putin. It was released in February 2008. And at the same time, many of our sympathizers actually said, guys, we love you and all, but you're crazy, because Putin's 8 years of presidency actually delivered a remarkable economic performance. Of course, there were a lot of problems, growing inequality, growing corruption, deteriorating underfinanced infrastructure, bad quality police services, bad healthcare, a lot of stuff which we wrote about. But on top of that, we had over 8 years average growth of real personal incomes over 12% a year. So basically we were told, guys, nothing beats that. I mean, people are ready to forgive because their well-being, the living standards are improving. And actually this was the major concept of the time, that this like 45-degree forward curve economic, in terms of GDP, in terms of real incomes, would continue forever. That was the business as usual assumption. Then bang, after 6 months, financial crisis explodes, which had a tremendous impact on the subsequent political developments in Russia, because for the first time in actually very many years, after 2008, we began to see real mass protest rallies across the country from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. Second, we began to see major defeats of the ruling United Russia Party at the regional and municipal elections also across the country, which have culminated with a very weak result of United Russia in December 11th parliamentary elections. Obviously, another major important waypoint which sparked the big protests of winter of 2011-2012. As a matter of fact, for those who persist with the business as usual Putin super popularity scenario at the moment, I have to remind that at the time being, Putin's nationwide approval ratings, which were confirmed even by pro-Kremlin pollsters, were in low 40s. He had like 41, 42, maybe 44% popularity and approval, which have basically lasted until the annexation of Crimea. So when the annexation of Crimea happened, eventually Putin for almost 3 years have been hanging with very low approval. And people were questioning, will he be able to withstand the next federal election cycle in 2016-2018. Then we had another bang, obviously, after which the direction was radically changed, and no one expected that. We can talk a bit later. I don't think it fits into a format of my introductory remarks, but We can talk a bit later, if you'd like, about why what happened became possible and why Putin decided to act the way he did. But essentially, this had dramatically changed the whole direction of Russian politics. Weak Putin and challenging next federal elections have gone. His popularity approval ratings skyrocketed, and you all know about that. So the dwellers on the business as usual format again changed their vision, and now this is basically all we can hear. Putin's supremacy, he's so super popular, there is nothing standing in his way of staying in power forever. However, if you take a look at the deeper Russian situation, it's actually very different from this headline reality. First, even the opinion polls that suggest that Putin is super popular, many of them provide a composition of his approval rating, which will tell you a drastically different thing that you might read in the headlines. First, there is only a very limited number, like 10–15%, which has been explained in detail by some of the pollsters, who are his die-hard fans and who approve of him because they think he's a great leader who's done a lot for Russia, and they would prefer him to stay for as long as possible, and so on. Great majority of Russians who say that they approve of the actions of the Russian president actually add to this, that they consider his performance to be more or less good. They're grateful for him to some of the issues that he's done, but at the same time, the same people point at a lot of discomfort and disproportions and problem issues that continue to persist and essentially worsen in the Russian life. That basically people see no alternative. At least Putin, they know him, but there is nobody else in sight who can potentially replace him. And one more important factor, which is, I think, is a crucial factor of Russian politics at the moment, people fear change. They actually think, majority of Russians does think that change may be chaotic, might bring a lot of undesired, unpredictable developments. And Russian authorities are extremely skillful and efficient in actually promoting that particular message, saying that, okay, you might not like something, but the alternative is total chaos. See what happens in Ukraine. This is what they say. Ukraine is a separate topic, but this is how they used to scare Russians on television. Russians do get scared of that. There is really, I think, the key factor which is keeping Putin's government afloat is not his super heroic popularity, but rather the fear of change among the great masses of the Russian population. However, at the same time, you could see that over the past 3.5 years, this patriotic euphoria, which really was taking place after the annexation of Crimea, is essentially eroded. Same pollsters who would tell you that Putin enjoys a very high approval also say that I think there is a consensus on that among pollsters, that about 70% of Russians demonstrate absolutely no interest towards any subjects associated with international politics. At the same time, this is true that majority of Russians approve foreign policies of Putin, but about 70%, which is roughly an average figure, say that we pay no attention to whatever events taking place in Syria, Donbass, United States of America, wherever. We're not interested in geopolitics. However, at the same time, there is a very, very clear demand that the government finally shifts its attention to domestic economic situation, which is pretty dire. Also, would touch a bit on this a little later. There is a growing gap, which is going back to the beginning of my remarks, one of the classical cases when there is a very, very strong growing gap between the needs of the society, the aspirations of the society, and what the government and what the system is doing. The gap at the moment is extremely clear. Great majority of Russians wants the government to refocus its attention on domestic social and economic situation, which is really not good. At the same time, government is doing its best trying to distance itself from it. This is the first time in my living memory, and I may look a bit younger, but I'm so old that I used to go vote at the elections in the Soviet Union and had my first job in the Soviet Union. So this is the first time in my living memory, after many crises and many difficulties that we had experienced over the years, when the government does not have an anti-crisis program to address what is arguably the most severe economic crisis since the collapse of the USSR. What they keep saying is just, guys, you gotta wait a couple of years. We already returned to growth. We have record low inflation, which I travel a lot across Russia. Believe me, these words that are heard daily by Russians from the television screens make them very angry. They say, what sustainable growth? What low inflation? Have you been to the next grocery store? Where are you working? Do you know how much your salary has depreciated over the past 3 years in terms of its purchasing power? So that gap is really what matters right now in the Russian politics, because Putin and his government, they want to continue to be the geopolitical players, focus on all these adventures that we have been observing. But there is a very, very different demand from the Russian society. And there are other indicators like, you know, again, if you take a look at the same opinion polls that show you the popularity of Putin, nearly every other single aspect of his social economic policy, except foreign politics, is in a healthy red zone. It has a negative approval. More people disapprove of anything that government is doing domestically than approve. If you take a look at approval ratings of all other elements of Russian power except the president, regional governors, mayors, United Russia Party, the parliament, the prime minister, the cabinet of ministers, it's balancing at 50% at best, but most of the other elements are also in the negative territory. So the gap is clearly there. Ilian has been mentioning the really very impressive regional rallies in support of Alexei Navalny. One thing is very clear, is voluntarily Putin will not be able to gather as many people on the streets in his support as Navalny does today. Because, again, I began mentioning that I come from the energy world. Believe me, I have megatons of complaints from the guys who still work in that system in different government-controlled and affiliated energy companies. They are also extremely angry that they are being from time to time forced to attend pro-Putin rallies by mandatory order, stay out there in the cold. Everything that you see on television, that we had a rally, we had a mass gathering in support of Putin in Moscow, 100% this was gathered through administrative pressure. People were forced to attend. There is no such thing as a voluntary rally in support of Putin that has ever happened in the past few years. On the other hand, there is an enormous, massive, and very enthusiastic turnout, not just in support of Alexei Navalny as an individual, but as an agent of change. A lot of people really are afraid of the perspective of this current stagnation and a risky situation that we might engage in one more geopolitical affair which will be disastrous for the country, for the economy, to be extended for another 6 years. A lot of people don't want that. This is actually so much different from just personal support of Navalny, but more and more people realize that they really want a competitive scenario for the upcoming presidential election. They are really afraid, they just don't want everything to be formally signed and sealed for a 6-year extension of Putin's mandate. So it's not about Navalny, it's about competition. And speaking about scenarios for the presidential election, I think one thing is also very clear. Navalny is the only candidate right now that symbolizes real change and real competition. So the choice for the Kremlin is either to allow him to run or not. This will be not a legalistic, but a purely political decision, because legally there are ways how to let him run. So it's going to be obviously a decision of a political nature. And of course, Putin is tempted to have it within a usual scenario, totally controlled, with no risky candidates, only a handful of dedushkas who've been around for 25 years. However, everybody, even inside this current government, this administration, basically understands that if Putin will be afraid to have Navalny as an open competitor, if he will choose a toothless option of running against three useless, harmless dedushkas, his supremacy, which has been cultivated for the past 3 years, that he enjoys 90% support, he ain't afraid of anybody, this supremacy will be gone. And even people in the establishment will understand that. So essentially, he doesn't have a good scenario for the March 2018 election. Many people try to narrow this discussion down about whether his mandate will be formally extended for 6 years or not. But the question is so much bigger. The question is, how does, okay, let's assume his mandate is extended, but how does he enter his new term? As the guy who just received a clear rubber stamp from the Central Election Commission that yes, he is supreme, everybody loves him, there is nobody out there to challenge him, or as a guy who became afraid of real competition, or if he allows Navalny to run, a guy who either barely escaped runoff or was forced to have a second round of vote to get his victory. These are the perspectives for him, actually. So on the contrary, the task that we see for us, and I'm actively involved in Navalny campaign at the moment, we need to tear him down from the pedestal. Question is not about formal extension of his term. Question is to demonstrate that there's a really strong demand for change in the Russian society, a really strong demand for a real political competition and plurality. And these elections are a very good, I think a perfect chance to demonstrate it. I think looking at the recent energetic rallies across cities which were non-existent on the Russian political map in the past 25 years, Arkhangelsk, Novokuznetsk, Biysk, have you ever heard, look, I'm sure many people in this audience have heard about these places, but really they did not exist on the Russian political map. So we are committed to make this process of deciding with Russia for the next 6 years or more as much competitive as possible, to demonstrate that there is the other part of society which demands different direction of Russian development. I think the topic of this seminar today sounds a bit optimistic, Russia after Putin. But, you know, I mean, we're not just there yet, but let's make the first step. Let's create a situation where it will be extremely hard for Putin to avoid real competition the way he likes. Let's force him into facing real competition and talking to opponents who are, in a lot of aspects, not less stronger than him. So this is what we are committed to doing, in which regard I strongly advise you to watch what is happening in Russia politically. And I strongly advise against thinking about this in a mere boring business as usual terms. A lot of things are happening. There will be a lot of interesting developments, and I believe ultimately Russia will be back. I'll stop here. Would love to take part in the discussion.
Thank you, Vlad. I think now comes the best part of it, is questions and answers. And so if you have any, please jump, because the competition is on. So if you don't miss, if you miss the chance, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. Nick, yes. Alex?
Actually, I have a question. I didn't know that. Piontkowski wrote an article just a while ago, a few days ago, in which he said that the new American sanctions, which ask for concrete results on Russian mafia, Russian ruling class, to be presented in 180 days. And he thought that this would be a a huge blow to them, and by that he meant also Putin, that things are changing in a very, very rapid way. What's your take on that?
I don't really think that this will be a very important development. I think primarily what matters is the economic impact of already existing sanctions on Putin's system and key monopolies and major state companies, because what happened, and this had a contrary to mainstream view that sanctions don't matter, you can hear a lot of this stuff. They do matter a lot because Russia essentially finds itself in an international credit blockade. We are not able to borrow money internationally. And this is a huge factor because our modest recovery since 2008 financial crisis was built on insane amounts of foreign borrowing by the corporate and banking sector, not by the government, by companies and banks. They kept borrowing and borrowing, and from what I hear from people on the summit of Russian power who are engaged in economic policy, this problem was not on the radar screen of Putin when he made the decision to invade Crimea. Because guys like Sechin, the head of Rosneft, who is the #1 borrower out of all Russian companies and banks, he's been saying, look, all these JP Morgans and Morgan Stanleys, they will be lining up to lend me money because they benefit from it commercially and I'm a good borrower, right? So Putin, I think, did not believe that the West will be able to firmly demonstrate its unity and actually disrupt the inflow of credit from Western financial markets into Russia. A recent sanctions bill that was adopted basically conserves this situation for an undetermined, indefinite period. That is the key problem. And I think this is actually one of the major reasons why Putin is meddling into politics of Western countries, because he wants forces that might change that to actually take back control and do something. All this personal stuff, I mean, look, investigations of how wealthy Putin and his cronies are, where they keep their money, I mean, the way they got them in a corrupt manner, this is not so important as the financial blockade and the ban on Western borrowing, which is, the situation right now is very simple. After adoption of the sanctions bill in August, this will hardly change in the coming years. So the major pressure on the Russian economic system would remain, and this will contain ability of Putinomics to recover from the current crisis. This will essentially prolong the stagnation.
Okay, now let's make clear, because at the end we'll have a joint question and answer so that Yulia can also step in. So I'll take only one or two questions. Okay. Nick.
Yes. You were very right to mention that Russian
Microphone.
I'll speak loudly. I hope everyone hears me. Okay?
Please.
Thank you. Well, sir, as you mentioned, Russian history for a very long time has been a series of long periods of stagnations when pressure grows, but people are trying to hold them up, and then big shake-ups, revolutions, chaos. Now, how do you see Russia getting out of this vicious circle, and without major shake-up, without bloodshed, without horrible things that may happen, to start a transition to democracy? How do you see it? Thank you.
It's extremely important, and I think, again, as much as arguing against business as usual scenario, I would argue against one major assumption that a lot of people mistakenly take, that one day things will change and Russia will become a stable democracy and things will be good from then on forever. No. You see that in many, even in European Union member states. It is democracy is an eternal struggle. It is not a given. Even in developed society, you have to fight for it, not to mention countries like Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Macedonia, what have you, right? I'm not continuing this list. Yeah, I'm not continuing this list, but you know what I'm saying, right? So, as a matter of fact, what is essential to do, for the first time in our history, we had a relatively prolonged period of plurality and a competitive political system under Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. It was obviously imperfect, but it survived. Yeltsin lived for several years after he was gone. And it was, again, it was the first period ever in the Russian history. We learned a lot from mistakes made in that particular period and afterwards, which allowed democracy to slip off our hands. Right now, I think a lot of people who are committed to achieving political change in Russia, I think we are much better skilled in terms of what we need to do to develop institutions, freedom of press, independent judiciary, real division of powers between different branches and so on. So I think we can only hope that the next period of plurality will last longer, be more successful. And, you know, throughout Yeltsin's rule, actually, I've written an article once, I can send you a link, it's in Russian, but still. We had about 6 or 7 waves of attempts to restore autocratic regime in Russia during Yeltsin era. And the last, when Yeltsin was gone, it was successful. Autocracy was finally restored. Actually, there will be further attempts to do so after Russia will become again a more pluralistic and freer society. We need to develop mechanisms to resist that. It will not be an easy task, and there will never be a guarantee. So that, oh, Russia is back into, you know, the family of democracies and we can turn the page and forget about all the bad guys and bad stuff, right? No. There will be more attempts, more skillful, there will be like eternal struggle. So what we need to do is we need to learn from the past experiences that we had, and we need to develop institutions. So all this current debate that we have in connection with Navalny's ideas and his program is basically about that. When you visit the regions, when you meet crowds of people, this is among top 3 questions that are being asked. How do you guarantee, exactly the same that you're talking about, how do you guarantee? And we explain just that. And we need to develop institutions, division of power, freedom of press, independent judiciary, and people need to be vigilant and to be on the watch, always. Not like happened under early Putin when he said, give me your political rights, I'll make you prosperous economically, right? Not like that anymore. You have to be on it daily to actually preserve pluralistic, open, free, democratic society. I would say it's 100% guarantee that we'll have another wave of resurgence of autocracy if we don't pay attention. So that's the answer.
Thank you. Wish you luck.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is absolutely delightful. In essence, after many, many years, and I think I would probably share the feeling of Ilyan of being a very difficult position of a fundamentally Russophile person who is put in a position to think very badly about Russia for many years. So thank you very much. You have seemingly made a difference. My question, sorry, Ilyan, it's one question, but 2 parts. It's related to, let's say, the view of Bulgaria from Russia, but it's a pragmatic question. When I say we, it's a sister organization of Alex and Ilyan, and I think Alex and Ilyan hopefully will help us, and certainly Carsten, whom you might know, is working on that. We are thinking about a sort of theoretical, long-term way of kind of rebuilding some kind of understanding, which is true history. And we've focused on organizing an event at the end of January, which would be trying to bridge the gaps in the understanding of the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War. I'm sorry to be asking this question because it, in a way, might seem totally unrelated to pragmatic issues of the current day. I really think that there are underlying trends that are very important and that we need to take care of. So my question is, Would you know people in your immediate circle or distant circle that might be willing to take part in such a conference where there will be Americans, British, French, Bulgarians, all sorts of things, where we will be trying to read the history which is read very differently in Russia by respectable Russian historians, and probably rightly so, from the way it is read by respectable British or Bulgarian historians. So would you this is first question, and sorry, first half of the question, and second half of the question is, I don't know how much you know Bulgaria, but I'm sure you know about the spread of Soviet type of monuments around Europe. And in some places like Estonia, they have been moved. So it's in a way a provocative question. But what do you think about Bulgaria moving the Soviet army monument from the center of the city to somewhere at the outskirts? Thank you.
Tricky. Well, just to make life easier for Vlad, we never talked about this, but Vlad, there's a tremendous difference in the way Bulgarians perceive monuments from the Russian-Turkish War and from the Soviet. For the Russo-Turkish War, monuments are well looked after, no questions, as everything is more. Well, there are some historians always dispute, but the Soviet, the question about the Second World War and the Soviet army are contentious, to say the least.
I have to say first, about all these historic issues, we have to go inside Russia through a great deal of debate and actually raising the public awareness. Because, for instance, we had a tragic anniversary of a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Believe me, public awareness in Russia about what it is so low that when, like, more or less ordinary Russians are being asked a question, what do they think? They open their eyes and say, what is it? We actually became aware of it. We were never taught this in schools. We became aware of it only during perestroika, that such thing exists. And it was a kind of a piece of a terrible learning because we had no idea, seriously. So, as a matter of fact, on the, deeply grounded society-based discussion, not a discussion with some of the elite historians or politicians or stuff like that. But if we're talking about a broader discussion between societies, I think the first thing that needs to be done is raising public awareness of all these issues. And speaking about the Second World War.
This is why we need a Russian to come here.
Yes, of course. Speaking about the Second World War, you meet clearly two different types of attitude in Russia these days. One type, which is like more my type, we consider it an extremely tragic event. So what's most important is the tragic part of it. We'd like this to never happen again. I think everybody, many parties have to admit that a lot of terrible things have been done, and not only on the part of the Nazis, because you have the Dresden bombings and you have the Soviet occupation and stuff like that, right? So when we talk, there's the other part, which is a fanfare part. All this great victory, patriotic and stuff. But, many people whose, relatives have been killed, who told them all these tragic stories about the war, right? There is a lot of actually demand for tuning down the fanfare a bit and just, remembering those who died and vowing to never allow this to happen again. So there are these two different approaches. Essentially, the rivalry between them is pretty similar as to what I described as the rivalry between the pluralistic democratic society and centrally controlled autocratic one, right? So these things are very much intertwined. I think you can't separate one from the other. The opening of Russia will reopen also the debate about what the Second World War was, about the monuments, because where there was the biggest, the most intensive drive to remove the Soviet monuments about Second World War, which was paid zero attention by the Russian government, Central Asia. Central Asia. It was like a brutal cleanup overnight. Nothing said in Moscow media. Absolutely. Russian television pretended not to notice at all. Not to mention our foreign ministry in the Kremlin and so on. So, but Estonia, you remember, right? So it's clearly just used as a politicized PR issue, and the discussion about it, I think we should have an honest debate after there will be room for it, after Russia opens up. And there is no uniform view on the events of that period. Speaking about Bulgaria, one thing I have to warn you about is that after Russia opens, inevitably, there will be still a very significant part, particularly of the Russian establishment, business elite, which will still think about neighboring countries as potential colonies. Let me be absolutely frank with you. This is the key question between Russia and the West now, the way it emerged over the years of Putin's rule. He wanted exclusive zone of influence over the post-Soviet space. And he thought that the West should grant him this exclusive zone and not interfere, neither in Ukraine nor in Georgia, elsewhere. He did not recognize full sovereignty of these countries, and he's just a man, after all. He didn't invent it. There was a huge drive on the part of Russian establishment to actually colonize everything that surrounds us. So, but the idea was always that, okay, let's have post-Soviet states as exclusive zone of influence. But there was always a suspicion that actually they will not stop at this and go further. I have to, unfortunately, mention Bulgaria as probably #1 candidate on the list. If Putin and whoever succeeds him in this authoritarian government wants to expand this theoretical exclusive zone of influence, a lot of people mention Baltic states, but we did have a lot of difficult history with Baltic states, and there will be a lot more discomfort to try to do that. There will be a hostile scenario outright, but here, maybe not so much. So I would say that speaking about potential future relations with Russia, you also have to bear in mind that there will be significant camp in Russia which will not treat you as an equal partner, and there will be a rivalry between two camps. Like, I represent a camp who says, look, we're all equals. We should treat our neighbors as equals, respect their sovereignty, and essentially give up all this crazy geopolitical stuff, right? But there is the other camp, which is influential. It will endure. It will survive well beyond Putin and Putinism. You will have to deal with this attitude in Russian society. I mean, this is reality, and together we have to overcome it somehow in the future.
Super. Okay. Now let's slightly and gently move to our next item on the agenda and give le parole. Il est la parole. It's a la. Thank you. To Yulia. She would deliberate further on the economic fundamentals and the detriment and the determinants of Putin's rule. Yulia, please.
Thank you for the floor. The years of 1999 till 2004 were a period of dynamic development in all sectors of the Russian economy. The GDP has seen the increase of 7% per year. Over 17 years of the Putin's rule, the federal budget revenues grew from 23 billion euro to 326 billion euro. The poverty rate fell from 28% in 1999 to just 13.5% in 2016. The income, per capita income in Russia doubled since the turn of the millennium. All these figures created the illusion of the Putin's effective economic policy. However, this presumption turns out to be decisive and had nothing in common with reality. As is known, economy is a very innate mechanism, and developing under certain trends of previous years and as well, and sorry, and under political circumstances and social premises, it is affected not just by internal economic factors, but also with authorities. But at the same time, we should take into account that the authorities can affect the economic policy just in a long-term period, not in a short or medium. Following this logic and assuming that Putin stay in power till at least 2024, I argue that the Russian economy will develop innately, without any sharp or radical changes, but it will become more and more affected by domestic political factors. To prove the relevance of this scenario, we should look back into the history and to take account on the drivers behind the Russia's economy and the reasons for the crisis, as well as to determine the features of Putin's economic policy. The Russian economy, in its current form, emerged after the crisis of 1998, and since then, the economic progress of Russia were based on three key factors. The first one is, for sure, skyrocketing oil prices. As is known, skyrocketing oil prices brought the budget revenues at least €2 billion per year. The second factor is the ruble devaluation effect, when the Russian goods and services became more competitive on the international arena. And the third factor, which is last but not the least, was the reduce of investments in non-financial sector, whose share in GDP dropped from around 30% in the late Soviet times to just 13% in 2016. Up to 10% of Russia's GDP was diverted to the current consumption when people lived in the illusion of the effectiveness and good performing in economic sphere. But by the time the world experience shown that there is no crisis-free way out from the overheated economy, because by the year 2008, Russian economy was overheated, and the growth was concentrated in non-tradable sectors: finance, billing, real estate, and so on. So the crisis of 2008 became very destructive for the Russian economy. It took 11 quarters to cope with the consequences of the crisis, and the key output of this crisis was that the factor of the pre-crisis model of an enabling national environment was exhausted, and no other factors or mechanisms to the economic growth were found. A further economic progress would depend on a political course. Meanwhile, the Russian economy was subordinated to the existing regime. Since coming to power, Vladimir Putin was aware that the popularity of the national leader in Russia is not and actually cannot be related just on economic achievements. That is why he combined his image of an effective manager with particular features of a political leader that could face and actually who capable of facing historical challenges like the Chechen War, like the reintegration of the post-Soviet space, and recently the so-called return of the Crimea in the Russian Federation. In early 2010s, after the failure of the modernization project, which was headed by Medvedev, the political and ideological component of all the decisions that was taken by the government outweighed economic considerations. Putin's return to the Kremlin in 2012 called into question the pragmatism and rationality of the Russian economy. It has also resulted in a very assertive and I would say very aggressive policy on the international arena. In the situation when oil prices were declined, Putin was pretty sure that nothing terrible could happen. He was also sure that the economy, maybe not in the good, maybe not in the best condition, but still it could function very good. And to prove that, it is just enough to look on the military budget of the country. 1/4 of national GDP, which is worth of 70 billion euro, was allocated for the military budget up to 2020, and that and at the same time, to cover the GDP deficit, Putin drew his attention to the entrepreneurs and actually Russian entrepreneurs were perceived as enemies who didn't want to pay taxes and who's not able to do that. That is why over 2 years, about 20 additional fees were imposed by the government. Tax rates were also increased. Hence, this situation led to the outflow or to the withdrawal of the capital. Just to look at the statistics, the outflow increased from around 30 billion euro in 2010 to more than 130 billion euro in 2014. Despite all this, the government didn't correct the economic course. So we know the developments of 2014, and I would say that the crisis of 2014 was the crisis which was caused by the internal nature and, first of all, mismanagement. And this situation demonstrates us that Putin's economic model is not compatible with the growth. For such an economic model, not only high oil prices are important, but also a constant increase in these prices. Meanwhile, the dominance of political factors over economic considerations took us to the conflict with Ukraine, I would say to the war with Ukraine. And I would reiterate that the crisis is caused by domestic issues, aggravated by the decline in oil prices, but attributed to the international political developments. All this allows the government to somehow regulate this popular dissatisfaction on the one hand, and on the other hand, to constrain from the fight in the crisis itself. So this situation creates the circumstances in which people just adjust to the economic situations, to the internal domestic policy. But nothing terrible has happened, and I'm pretty sure that nothing could happen. I'm not sure that there will be a popular dissatisfaction and protest that could really affect Putin's model. In coming years, Russia will undergo a severe economic downturn, which is already underway. And it might continue until at least the early 2020s. Russia's economy will prove unable to diversify, and the energy sector, even if contracted, will remain the core industry. Regarding the energy sector, I would like to underline two things. The first one, till there is a demand for the Russian gas and oil, Russian economy will operate quite smoothly, with certain downturns and not very high, but still economic growth. And the second point is that while the old places of extraction of oil and gas depleting, new places in eastern part of Siberia will be developed. And according to Sergei Alexashenko, about 5% of such places are already developed in the eastern part of Siberia, but this number will grow. Russia cannot increase oil production, but it is also unable to reduce this. The latter is possible only in case when countries, and especially the EU as a main consumer of the Russian gas, will boycott it. But again, the situation shows that the EU is not ready to boycott it. It will reduce it, but slowly. And perhaps it will substitute with Iranian oil and gas. But again, Russia can deliver oil and gas to neighboring countries, for example, to China. But for sure, such a circumstance won't be very profitable for the Russian economy. The effect of shale gas on the horizon of 10 years will be weak enough, because its extraction in oil will remain weak enough according to different estimates, and America is not ready to deliver it also, because it will undermine the economy of many investment projects. Just to sum up with my speech, I would say that in coming years, Vladimir Putin's unwillingness to make serious political reforms related to the restoration of the independent judicial will be the main obstacle to improving the investment climate in the country. Without this, the Russian economy will not be able to count on a steady increase in investment. But at the same time, the weakening of the economy does not mean that the regime will disappear, will crash, because as it seems to me, the Russian political regime, I would say, not only regime but also policy, both domestic and external, are based on not rational factors and not economic factors, but on, if you want, on psychology. And in this stance, I would support Dominique Moisis, who's the French philosopher, opinion that Russian policy is based on resentment towards the EU and USA, because as the Russian government believes it wasn't treated equal in the 1990s. It is also based on the feeling of fear, because the Russian elites, first of all, are afraid of losing its power. And all the developments in internal policy prove us that this situation lead to very destructive economic performance, but still it is operating. And the third one is nostalgia. And nostalgia is consistent not only to the Russian elites, but also to the population. And the Russian population remember the time of the economic growth when they acquire better well-being, when they could freely make trips and so on. And this period of time is strictly related to Putin. That is why Putin will be perceived well enough, at least I could say till 2020s. But even after Putin retirement or demise, I don't know, it doesn't guarantee that the regime will disappear. This regime will be, but with a new face. And with this time lag and with these circumstances, I think that the West should be more decisive in his measures and behavior towards Russia to push it to the world community. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
I expected to listen more to the discussion on what will happen after Putin. 10 years prognosis. Most of the time we are talking about if he will step out of power or fall down from power, and why. But the situation is interesting to talk about what will happen after his coming down from power. And what are the social forces, politically, economically?
Okay, Plamen?
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, the Putin regime will continue, will survive after Putin. So can you describe more clearly the KGB origins of this regime, the KGB rooted and steered regime of Putin? Thank you.
I would say that now KGB is not the main factor of stability of the Putin's regime. It's not just about KGB, but it's about his counterparts, comrades, as you wish. Not all of them are from this sphere. At the same time, we should mention that except Silovikis, there is another group of people, like, for example, Kudrin, Glaziev, and so on, who are more in power or more in charge of economic performance of Russia. And in this sphere, economy, Putin relies mostly on the views and opinions of Glaziev, Nabiulina, and so on, but not on the KGB. Even despite the fact he has received his PhD in economics. I'm not sure, remember 2 or 3 years ago, but still. I hope that will be enough. Thank you.
Super. Okay. She has a valid point. If you impose the matrix of KGB from the old days, you would never understand what's happening. So they have newborn networks and webs of that are based more on money and business and than on. Okay, now let's see.
What is, in your opinion, the necessary condition or conditions to return the Russian economy to growth, sustainable and not only you mentioned the high and increasing oil prices. That's not going to happen. Nobody is going to allow the oil prices to go up forever.
Gas as well.
Yeah, neither gas. So what's the, in your opinion, is the plausible scenario to return Russia to growth? And second question is, you mentioned this Glaziev, who I didn't know that he has any real influence. I thought he's just the scary guy who puts up some scary ideas and, on nationalization and, fixed exchange rate. throwing out the dowers and so on. But you now say that Putin is listening to this guy. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about this.
The part of the listening.
Yeah, whether he has any real influence, because my impression is that there is a number of people who are like this Mikhail Khazin and so on, who talk a lot of nonsense, but anti-Western and so on, but Putin listens more to the guys like Kudrin.
Yeah.
And
thank you for the question. If you're not against, I will try to speak first about the second question and then turn to the first one. I mean, Glaziev is not the only person with his opinion who is more or less heard by Putin. It is also Nabiulina in the banking sector, for example, it's also Kudrin, as you said, with his very balanced approach, I would say. It's not about growth, but it's also not about the slowdown, economic meltdown. As to the first question, conditions for the growth, to be honest, now I can't see any conditions to that, because oil prices will never go higher than they were in the 2000s. The second factor that could be that actually could lead to the economic growth was modernization. But now Russia is restricted to new technologies by the sanctions imposed. Moreover, Putin has already demonstrated his unwillingness to do anything in economy. According to him, it is just sufficient that the economy operates somehow. And the budget is more or less on the same level, because according to his view, according to the so-called Putin's doctrine, one of the main issues is that the deficit of the budget shouldn't be more than 1%, because he remembered the crisis of 1998. And following this logic, I really can't see any conditions for the growth. The weakening of the ruble, with the devaluation of the ruble, will just help Russian services and the goods to be competitive on the post-Soviet space and China, and maybe some economies of the some markets of the third world. I'm sorry. It will be stable enough. Without any changes. That may be everything we can.
Old late days of Brezhnev and so on, when you had 10, 15 years with no growth.
Yeah, that's actually the situation. The situation of stagnation with because Russian economy in this period and actually the crisis of the feature of the crisis of 2014 is that there is no any prerequisites for the growth in comparison to the crisis of 1998 and the crisis of 2008. Because after that, after those crises, there were a slow but still growth. Now there is no any conditions; they are exhausted.
So no replacement of import. There is no effective replacement of import, like they proclaim, and they say, okay, import is the machine. It kind of creates new industrial growth and so on. Even Vladimir mentioned there is some economic growth reported of 2.7% in the second quarter, and so on. But
yeah, but
you say that that's not like imaginary.
But what is 1% of the economic growth for Putin? It's nothing after 7. When we speak about the stagnation, this is the period when there is just a slight growth of 1%, and for example, Sergei Alexashenko in his latest report counted that the growth could vary 0.5% and 1%, and the decline of 1% or 1.5%. As to the agriculture, if you mean the food sector, thanks to the sanctions, Russian agriculture started to develop more or less. For sure, everybody understands that the quality of this production is not the best one and is not compatible to the European standards. But still, there is cheese, there is ham, there is poultry, so we have something to eat. It's not of the best quality, but still we have. The import was substituted, the European import was substituted by Brazilian products, by Argentina's project. So more or less, as I said, it is operating, and it will be. But when we were talking about the conditions for the growth, for me, growth under the Putin is perceived at least at the level of 5% per year, but 1 year for Putin is nothing.
Okay, we will come back on the final round session.
Let me ask one short question concerning, you mentioned that the Russian government and Mr. Putin is allocating too much resources to security and defense. Does the Russians recognize, and the Russian government including, that they actually are initiating a new arms race in conventional weapons and also in nuclear weapons? And it seems to me that the Russian politicians, the ruling politicians, didn't learn well the lessons of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Allocating too much money to security and defense actually does not allow the Russian government to raise the living standards of the common Russians, let's say. And what will be the effect of this approach if the Russian government continue to allocate too much money for security and defense? Thank you.
Actually, when we talk about the military budget, for over at least 5 years, the money allocated for the military budget is about 1/4 of GDP. The maximum of the maximum of money that were allocated for the military purposes were 2015 with, if I'm not mistaken, it was about 80 billion euro. There is a small or a slight decrease in military budget now, but what is too much money? The Russian military and defense complex or industry is one of the most functioning, is one of the most compatible. For example, Iranians, the Azerbaijani, Armenian people are very interested in Russian armaments. And due to that, the Russian government has at least several tens of billion of ruble per year. And for the Russian economy, what is too much? It is better, according to the Putin, according to his doctrine, to reduce investments, or, for example, or just to slow the reduce the pensions, but the military or the defense industry is one of those sectors that Putin rely on. That's all. Thank you. If it is enough.
Mille grazie, as the French would say.
Many people talk about the return of state capitalism, and some of the examples are China and Russia. Between 2005-2015, Russia has increased its state contribution to the gross domestic product, which is, I think, now more than 70%. Comes from state companies or state-related activities as a growth in gross domestic product. Also, companies like Gazprom, Rosneft, they look like corporate structures or some private structures, but actually they are state-owned or organized and managed by state institutions, let's say, or persons that are there appointed by directly the president or some people around. And for me, it's a very sensitive question also for Bulgaria and Bulgarians, because here we face some problems with oligarch type of economy and oligarch capitalism, and etc. So many Bulgarians even they give an example as Russia or China and say, what a good economy. Why don't we develop our economy like them? What is your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I would fully agree with the assumption that in case of Russia, I mean, in case of contemporary Russia, we can talk about state capitalism. And maybe 2 weeks ago, I read a book that was a really nice one and very interesting, because according to the author, in contemporary Russia, we can see the transit from the crony capitalism of the 1990s to state capitalism. But again, I would say that when we talk, for example, about state investments, due to them, the Russian economy were capable to way out from the crisis of 2008. But again, right now, the investments of the state sector is not so high enough. We can speak about state, as you said, corporations, but only in key sectors of the Russian economy. In oil, gas, I mean, in these raw materials. We can't, but in other sectors, agriculture, for example, we can say that small and medium entrepreneurs are very welcomed, because again, due to them, right now we can see a small but still growth in the Russian economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vaz.
Thank you very much. 3-4 sentences only from my side. Oh, I remember so many things already, 68 and so on and so on. But for me, I overslept a bit Abkhazia and Ossetia to 8. But after mid-February or 20th February 2014, for me, what's going on now in this global Russian foreign policy is déjà vu, simply. Déjà vu. And I'm more and more afraid all those NATO-Russia now problems with continuation, even NATO-Russia Council on those things. Everything's clear. I served in Libya, so I saw their activities there, of course, 2005, 2009. Neighborhood Algeria, also. They forgot $5 billion euro debt for them. So many things. So I would say only three things now. First, only Russians can solve the situation in the sense of opening, as I listened to the speech of Mr. Milov. I am a big pessimist, unfortunately. That big pessimist. This is first, then deja vu, I would repeat. Feeling inside is really deja vu. And the third, I am pessimist even with Mr. Navalny, whom I support internally inside very much. But I am more afraid that his fate would follow Mr. Nemtsov than everything else. They will find a way to stop him, I'm afraid. Thanks.
Thank you for the commentary, and I'd like to say some words about it. First of all, I would completely agree with you about Navalny. I do not share this optimism about Navalny, because I'm pretty sure that he does, or he make really good deeds about anti-corruption deeds with his films and so on, but I'm not sure that it is possible to win elections just supporting the agenda of anti-corruption measures and about very corrupted Russian elite. Everybody knows it. That's not actually the case. I'm not sure that Navalny really understands what is going on, because I'm not sure, but maybe you have seen his discussion with Stelkov. The first, not actually the first, but I would say the only statement made me really pessimistic about him when he said that. Yeah, we annexed Crimea, but the war in Crimea costs very much. But that's not the thing that we really should now focus on. How could it be? That's the alternative to Putin. I have never seen his real opposition to the annexation of Crimea. That also makes me really aware and very alarmed about his views. I'm not sure that after his arrival to the power, to the Kremlin, the regime will be somehow changing, or even I'm pretty sure that his ambitions are not less than Putin's one. About the deja vu, yeah, for sure, I will also agree with you. But I'm not. I do not agree with Vladimir Milov, who said that. Who tried to elaborate the topic of the theoretical aggression, because the history and the developments of 2008, 2014 has already shown that Russia is not intended to be in direct confrontation with NATO, as well as NATO is not really interested in direct armed conflict with Russia. Look, Putin annexed Crimea only because it brought popularity to him and made his regime more stable. And the second reason for that was that it was possible due to the lack of the EU strategy. I think you will agree with me.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you have differences of it. If you want to.
No. It's enough. Okay.
Okay. Super. Okay. Now we move on to Alex's short presentation on the military, Russian military after Putin. He spent a lot of time advising and working for Rand Corporation and Balkan, so he would give you.
I'm interested in the military not because of the military itself, but because of what may happen after Putin. And here, I think Vladimir Milov already talked about this incredible 8 years where you could have both butter and arms. But what's an interesting story for me is in 1999, Putin had just become prime minister, and he gave a speech, I forget now where he said that the only area in which Russia is competitive with the West is the military-industrial complex. He actually believed that. Now, you can argue about that, but the point is that he believed it, and what he believed, because of the incredible jump in oil prices, $12 in 99 to $147 in 2008, there was enough for both to improve the quality of life and to start spending a lot of money on the military. And at the time, in 2011, when he came back after Medvedev, they started talking about incredible increase in their defense budget. And they talked about that the Russian GDP was going to go up to $5 trillion, and the defense budget will be $200 billion, which is to say that they could easily compete with the United States. Of course, it wasn't to be. I'm not going to dwell on that, but you need to remember that in 2011, Putin said that he was going to increase the defense budget by $700 billion, given that these projections of $200 billion and here are the numbers that he said he was going to guarantee. 1,500 new aircraft, both stealth aircraft and helicopters. 200 new air defense system, 400 new ICBMs, 2,300 new tanks, the Armata tank that you have heard about, and that the Russian military forces were going to be modernized to the tune of 70%. If you know what the situation is in Russia today, these are very, very bold targets. Of course, they did not happen, but it's interesting to compare what is happening today with what he was talking about at the time. So this is the fantasy. What's the reality? Well, the reality, of course, is that that oil prices collapsed, and so did Russia. The GDP of Russia today, according to Nemtsov, is less than 1 trillion. Some people say it's maybe 800 billion. Compare that to 5 trillion, and you see that there's a bit of a difference. The export income of Russia, which is mostly oil, 67% oil and gas, was $526 billion in 2013. It is now, in 2016, it's 230 billion, less than half of what it was. The procurement achieved the $700 billion that Putin wanted to spend on the military. Less than 1/3 of this has been achieved. In fact, some people say it's only a quarter. So that gives you an idea. The sanctions, according to economists, including Mr. Kudrin, the sanctions have cost so far $600 billion. So they're
they're not useless, and they do make a difference, especially because you will see in the following slide is that Russia today cannot build a missile without importing up to 75% of the electronics. It's simply not able to do that, and that's very significant. What is more significant, and this is something that you're not going to hear discussed in the Russian press, Russia has fallen behind, not only behind the United States in military technology, United States and Western Europe, but behind China and India. And this is a key difference because, as you know, even if it didn't have any other clients, as long as it had India and China, it can do well. In fact, this is no longer the case. I'll give you a little anecdote. A friend of mine was in Vladivostok, an American guy, and he said, I was amazed to hear that there is some kind of institute for icebreakers in an area in which the Russians have always been dominant. They've always had the best technology. He says, I was amazed to find out that they have 4 Chinese professors who teach them how to build icebreakers now. That's just as a sideline. So, what is happening today? Well, there's no money for the military, and they will have no choice but to start cutting. In fact, they cut the defense spending, I believe, by 8% last year. But more important than that is the diminishing technical ability of the Russian military industry to perform. You may know that the Russians sold or tried to sell a new stealth Sukhoi 57 to the Indians. Just about a month ago, the Indians sent them a list of 40 things they don't like about what's going on. And according to people that I know in the Indian ministry, said this is a complete flop. It's not going to happen. So, in other words, Russia can no longer count on clients such as India, which you could imagine what that means. The Armata tank, there was this miracle tank, in fact, has all kinds of problems, not just technical problems, but a huge problem with its cost. In fact, a Russian friend was telling me, well, they wanted to have like 10 battalions of Armata tanks. That would take the entire defense budget to do that. And if you look at the figures that they are now discussing in terms of how many tanks they can afford, it seems like very few. The same thing, and I don't want to get into details, but Russia today cannot build an aircraft carrier. It simply does not have the technical ability to do that. And this has happened in a very, very short period of time. According to a Russian expert, anywhere between 65 and 79% of the electronics that are needed to build a missile have to be imported from the West. And finally, the Ukrainian fact, I'm sorry to see that Mr. Baltaji, the Ukrainian ambassador, is no longer here. But as those of you that know something about the Russian military would know that Ukraine produced a very large part of what the Russian military did. It's not just Yuzhmash, and they produce, for instance, they produce virtually all the helicopter engines for Russian helicopters. This has fallen by the wayside. And here, if I'm allowed to go on a tangent, which will show you how old I am, but I'm probably the only person in this room that knew Solzhenitsyn personally. And the way I met him, he was doing research for his August 14 book at the the Hoover Institution, which has the Kerensky archives. And so I met him there and went to lunch with him several times. And so one day, he, by the way, I mean, Solzhenitsyn to me is a reactionary, but he was a very, very strong Russian nationalist. And at one point, I asked him, what will make Russia not be a huge power, a world power? He said, there's only one thing that could happen that will prevent Russia from being a huge power, and that is if somebody takes Ukraine from us. And that's exactly what has happened. Which, so in some ways, he was ahead of his time. But so, what is the key problem here? It's not a matter of money. It's a much more serious problem. And the problem is that Russia is no longer a knowledge economy. It has always been a knowledge economy. Russia always had highly educated population. And as you well know, I don't need to repeat that. It is no longer that. This is an astounding change. The most serious detriment to Russia's future is the fact that they are no longer a knowledge economy. Russia today, among the medium income countries, is the only country alongside Argentina that does not produce a single high-tech item that's sold in the West. In 1990, Russia had 6% of the people with tertiary education, in other words, people after university education in the world. Today it's 2%. By 2030, according to Nick Eberstadt, who is the great expert in that, it'll be less than 1%. So this is a very, very disturbing. I highly recommend to any of you that might be interested a book which was just published. It's called Russia in Decline, published by Jamestown Foundation with the participation of many, many Russian experts. Half of them Russian experts, half of them American. And you will find data there. The US Patent Office, 0.23% of patents approved by the US Patent Office of Russian origin. This is dismal. It cannot get worse. World service exports, less than 1% is Russian. This is what is meant by Russia no longer being a knowledge economy. I don't want to even talk about the demographic issues and the brain drain, but the brain drain is serious. This year, 350,000 Russians are immigrating from Russia. Most of them going to places like the United States. I think there are 275,000 applications for green cards to the United States alone. And what that means is, I don't know how many people of you know that, but if you look at what happened in Russia after 1990, there's a country called Israel. Israel received a gift from Russia, which, according to people that know these things, tell me that this is the largest present one nation is made to another. What is that gift? 38,000 engineers, 11,000 scientists. And of course, these people are lost to Russia. So this, to me, is the reason that it'll be very optimistic to believe that Russia will actually improve rapidly unless it's able to solve this problem of not being a knowledge economy anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now is the most interesting part where we take questions from, and I expect everybody to be able to address them in whatever manner and whatever scope. Well, please, I'll abuse my privilege of being the moderator and ask Vlad one thing, because I remember at the time he was, one of his greatest achievements at the time was that he wrote in his capacity as deputy minister, he wrote a strategy of restructuring at Gazprom, which cost his job, actually. And, but he's deeply versed in the energy sector, and I believe there's one question, there are so many questions that are relevant to Bulgaria, but one of them is Rosatom. We are stuck in a very interesting situation where we've paid for 2 reactors. Rosatom initially claimed that they've already produced them, which is not the case, but we paid, then started moving. The key question is where Rosatom, because they claim to have the longest list of nuclear MPPs all over the world, but their business model is to receive subsidies from the state budget. Without those subsidies, they wouldn't be able to offer the build, own, operate and T scheme, as in Akuyu in Turkey. Now, obviously the budget would not be able to sustain this flow of cash. They cannot borrow on the international. How credible would be their sort of proposals that they can deliver on time, fund on time, finance on time, and basically deliver roses?
First, I have to say, just for your information, speaking about the budget financing, after the crisis broke out in 2014, initial plans to finance the nuclear power industry were cut by about 50%. And 50%. And essentially, the focus of the remaining financing was on the domestic power plants, which are in most advanced stages of construction. Anything greenfield basically was moved to, sometime later, when we become great again. The second point is that very important issue. Kiriyenko was the key, bringer of this drive for nuclear expansion and construction of reactors all over the world. He departed. Essentially, he has other job now. New management of Rosatom had, I can find you links, openly admitted publicly in interviews that essentially this impressive portfolio that Rosatom had drawn up over dozens of new reactors all over the world is not going to happen. They did not provide details as to the reduced scale and what will happen and what will not, but essentially they publicly and very clearly confirmed that these were just castles in the sand. So the reality will be very seriously downgraded.
Including the Akuyu?
No. Listen, I'm just coming to that point. The third point is that still major source of potential financing for nuclear expansion abroad, nuclear reactor construction abroad, was considered not the budget money, but the loans from state banks, which somehow guaranteed by the government and so on. This is a scheme that they intend to use in most places, including the Akuyu, including Bangladesh, including other, Hungary and so on. So right now, they don't say it, but they have extreme difficulty in actually obtaining this financing for one simple reason. Because of our crisis, you see that big private banks have been collapsing recently. This is just the top of the iceberg symptom of the difficulties that we have in the banking system, because we do not know how many bad, toxic stuff banks got on their balance sheets. It is safe to assume that the situation in the state banks is much worse than in those private ones who've been recently nationalized and actually went bankrupt. However, I have to say that obviously state banks are in a better position because the government is always out there to save them, so they will not fail. But in terms of their balance sheets, the situation is quite bad. You don't find it in the papers, but believe me, it's there. which is why they are extremely hesitant to provide new financing to all these projects which will begin to generate cash sometime in the 22nd century, I don't know. This is why Rosatom has great difficulty obtaining this financing. It has also, you could see the model for that type of debate. You could easily see on, for instance, the example of Yamal LNG project. Novatek is building actually a world-class, very good, very effective LNG plant way out there in the north. But because of the sanctions, they needed more financing. They got some from Russian state banks, but it was only given on a strict condition, outstanding government guarantee. No, and this is the project in a very advanced stage. It will begin to generate cash very soon, almost completed, will be launched sometime soon. So in a much better position that, you know, beginning building some NPP in Bangladesh, which might never ever actually come to a point of generating returns, but we're talking about really good project like Yamal LNG is. And even in this case, given the big amount of equity financing from Chinese, from shareholders and other stuff, financing from the National Welfare Fund and so, still, state banks demanded outstanding government guarantee. Now the Ministry of Finance is absolutely not thrilled to provide outstanding guarantees to projects like that, because one of their key mantras is to keep the government debt, public debt, low. Keep it under control. This is actually one of when Putin and his government start to brag about their financial achievements, saying, oh, but we have low public debt. All the foreign debt we have is corporate banking debt, but the government debt is very low. Now, in this regard, outstanding financial guarantee in terms of the balance sheet, it essentially makes no difference from if the government starts to borrow the money. So Minfin doesn't want to give outstanding guarantees, particularly for a castless in the sand projects like that, right? So I would say it's safe to say that Rosatom experiences great difficulty in obtaining financing. I believe they will be able to raise money for some of the projects, but definitely not for all this long list of portfolio that they had. Which projects will be there, we can only guess. It's clearly that Bangladesh will be there. Akuyu most likely is of political importance as well, and I think financing will also be found for that. Now for others, it's a big question, and also because we're talking about the banks, really it's not just taxpayers' money which government can spend with one signature and so, but it's more difficult situation. There will have to be a long process, and the banks will have to assess the viability of all these projects. So I think, you know, the more difficulty you have with a specific project in terms of hurdles, in terms of compliance with European Union laws, in terms of different other stuff, less likelihood that banks will be actually open to finance it. So I think we are at a completely, you know, uncharted territory. We can only second guess about what this could be, but definitely they will be down to just a handful of priority projects. They will not be able to finance these generous portfolios they drawn up previously.
Thank you, Vlad. That is just to give you an insight on the logic behind the drive to take us to arbitration, the strange way in which the process of arbitration evolved in the last leg, the moment that we had to fund this 600 million, which effectively opened up the manufacturing stage of and now that they are late, are not being delivered. So, and that's a very interesting question, just to give you how capable of the Russian state ambitions, or the president when he said that I would do the South Stream, I would do the Turkish Stream, I would do any stream. It's a total, if you read what Nebulina, it's just these days was just telling out to the public, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, they don't know even the extent of the crisis in the banking sector. As he said, once you get a proper audit or due diligence, you understand the toxic asset base, and you don't understand it because you have to go into it. Anyhow, super question. Plamen?
At the end of his days, Hitler believes in rockets V as a miracle weapon, as a dreaming weapon. And as we know, now Putin believes in a hypersonic rockets as a power. So I expect your comments about this observation. But first, let me remind you that already 80 years we live in the age what was described 80 years ago by Stalin as «жить стало лучше, жить стало веселее».
I expected that we will talk more about the future scenarios and possible developments after Putin. Mostly we talk about the present developments that may throw out Putin from power. Are you optimistic about any future developments? What are the scenarios? Because I'm not. In Russia, the liberal and the Democrat for 2 centuries have always been minorities, hated minorities. Mostly the Russian public is conservative until liberal. If we have mass discontent, it may create a revolutionary situation or throw somebody from power, but will it give some power to the liberals, even Navalny?
It basically, we're talking about 10 years from now, horizon. So the exit scenarios for Putin. Some time ago, I wrote a piece on it, and I discussed this sort of the Gorbachev type of exit, where actually he doesn't appoint who would succeed him. The Yeltsin type of exit, where he actually appoints someone as a successor, or the forceful act of exit, where simply he's kicked out of in a forceful manner, violence, some sort of.
First, Ian, let me finish on banks. I think it's very important. Just to give you an idea, how complicated the situation is. I just visited one of the Russian regions recently, and I was invited to a restaurant by a local businessman who actually owns the restaurant. And these are actually 2 different restaurants, a steakhouse on the first floor and a very nice cuisine Italian restaurant on the second floor. He just very recently opened it in the heart of the crisis. And both halls are totally empty. We were sitting there like at prime time in the evening, 8 o'clock, like maybe 1 or 2 tables on both floors were occupied except us. And I said, well, how do you survive in the crisis? He said, look, it's difficult. We have to introduce some cheap items on the menu to attract the middle class, but nobody is really coming. And I said, what about the financing? You just recently opened it. You must be into trouble. He said, no trouble. And he borrowed about 150 million rubles from Sberbank, which is not Открытие, not Binbank, but Sberbank. I say to him, look, your bank must be concerned, because he financed some stuff which is toxic by any standard. He said, no, I'm not into trouble, because the bank came to me and gave me an offer, said, look, let's restructure your loan, which was just basically freshly received. Let's restructure it for 5 more years and forget about it, said the bank. The bank came with, he was not chasing the client, give me my money back. No, they said, let's restructure and make it a long-term investment and so on. This is just to, and this is a massive story. The banks approach clients who are into trouble saying, guys, let's restructure and make it look on paper like it's good, right? This is what's happening. Actually, so the situation is really, really very troublesome. On the miracle weapon, generally, I was listening attentively to Alex talk about the Russian military. I have to say one important observation. There is a lot of talk about new models of Russian weaponry, whatever, from T-50 to Armata to S-400, whatever, right? Problem with those is that they have really not been very much tested in combat. And we yet to see whether, so, I mean, like examples, like ideas to be presented, they might sound good, but there's a big issue, there's a big if all this stuff is really going to work. We're yet to see that. And, you know, I'm a machine builder by education. I finished Moscow Mining University. I'm an engineer in machine building of equipment for coal mining. So in the 1990s, before I came to the government, I was actually touring a lot of defense manufacturing plants, trying to help them convert into producing energy sector equipment. So I know what I'm talking about. Knowing all this manufacturing culture, I have strong doubts that all this new stuff and miracle weapons will really be reliable on a mass scale, which is an issue to be watched. Now, about scenarios. I disagree that we didn't talk about the future. Actually, I was asked a very important question about how do we avoid mistakes and make democracy linger and become sustainable. So essentially I described a future of permanent rivalry between different approaches. Autocratic restoration attempts, strong lobby and camp which will try to influence and shape the foreign policy in favor of same post-imperialist approach, aggressive approach that Putin is doing. And the other camp, which argues for a more friendly foreign policy and for keeping the democratic institutions stable. The future is this rivalry. Definitely, we're not speaking about Putin's removal from power, just in terms of removal from power. We're speaking about opening up of Russia. Eventually, what's going to happen again, I strongly argue against the theory that once Russia opens up one more time, it will be forever. There's never a forever thing when it comes to Russia. So it will be an eternal struggle. We will be a far worse version of Hungary or Turkey in this regard. There will be obviously some backdraft in terms of changes that might occur. And the only thing which gives me optimism is that currently, basically, the team which is working on the changes in Russia under Navalny, first, we categorically refuse to be downsized to the labels of Democrat and liberals. Politically, we centrists. We're not liberals or Democrats. We might have certain democratic views, but we're centrists. And we are committed to create a big network communicating between politicians and the people. This is what Navalny's infrastructure is all about. And this is what never existed with the classical Democrats and liberals that you might be mentioning. The only exception was Boris Nikolaevich alone in 1991 in his campaign. So essentially, this is what we are committed to doing. There is a great deal of learning from the past mistakes. We are totally against, and we will do our best to fight against the attempts to downsize us to a bunch of egg-headed liberals in the capital. No. We're with the people. We know Russia very well. We spend a lot of time in the regions. We're ready to actively go and talk. I mean, to 5 babushkas, we're not hesitant. It doesn't really matter. We're really about daily and very intensive communication with ordinary people. So we are about to build a network supporting a totally different, open and competitive system that will have very strong support in the grassroots. This is what we are trying to do. How successful we will be, time will show, but you see clearly that there are certain breakthroughs which give a lot of room for optimism.
Well, I don't have much to add to what Vlad is saying. I certainly agree with his prognosis. What I would say maybe as an empty reason for optimism, I think it was Berdiaev who once said that in Russia, the night is always darkest just before dawn. And I don't think this that we're observing now can continue for very long. Because Russia is really going to the dogs economically. And sooner or later, something will happen. Now, it may not be a great cause for optimism immediately, but let's remember that before Putin took over Yukos was on its way to become one of the largest oil companies in the world after a fairly short period of time, and without really a very, very good legal system. So Russia does have a potential. The question is whether that will be utilized by people like Vlad and Navalny and others. There are many others. The point is that the current situation, in my view, cannot continue forever. And I think it could only get better, because it cannot get much worse.
The same was in 1917, but what happened?
Yeah.
Well, let me add to this 1917 remark, and also, we frequently ask this question when we talk to ordinary Russians about Ukraine. Key question is, will you be able to govern? This is what drastically, I think, is different from both 1917 and what is happening in Ukraine right now. We will be. We already have been through a lot of experience in the very difficult times, and we are capable of governing and not letting go, like the 1917 folks did. So that's the difference. Bear that in mind.
Super. Yes.
I want to add just some words about the basic scenario for the economy of Russia. As I said, the basic scenario relies on the assumption that according to the inertia of the economy, the Russian economy will see slight growth and slight decline of about 0.5 to 1%. The weakening of the ruble will be at the level of 15% according to different evaluations per year. And such evaluation will for sure hit up the inflation, and according to the estimations of Vladislav Nemtsov and Sergei Alexashenko, it could or it may exceed 10% a year, but that doesn't mean that there could be a very strong or a stiff reaction from the Russian population. So here I'm not sure that there were some. The people will go and invade the streets, and in order to meet budget restrictions, the government will reduce investments and investment courts and actively resort to the use of non-system resources, like, for example, the compensation of pensions pension savings in 2014 and so on. Thank you.
Okay, question? Gerasov.
Okay, could you touch a little bit upon the escalating North Korean crisis? Let's say the Russian approach to this crisis. There are a number of reports saying that probably Russia provided some assistance to North Korea to rapidly develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Do you think that Russia could influence North Korea to lessen, let's say, first of all, the tensions between North Korea and the United States, and also not to be so optimistic that it could survive in case of clash between North Korea and the United States? Thank you.
That's a tough question. You know, even when I was in government, trying to discuss the North Korea matter with different officials, I always met like this cold stone wall of avoidance. Attempt like not to notice this issue. Nothing is going to happen. They're going to sit out there forever in their North Korean hole, never attack anybody, so let's not worry about it. As a matter of fact, I don't see any meaningful strategy regarding what is happening on the Korean Peninsula from the Russian decision makers' side. But what I do see, though, is some sort of fear. Yeah, I'm not sure, again, there's been talk that Russia did help them enhance their military capabilities. I'm not sure about that. What I'm most certain about is that Russia does provide significant economic help to avoid economic catastrophe and continue this system to linger. And probably it's, the size of aid Russia provides North Korea is comparable to what China does at the moment. So in this whole Korean Peninsula equation, the Pyongyang regime, I think it's, to simplify, they look at like United States, South Korea, and Japan as the bad guys, and Chinese and us, they consider to be the good guys who are not against them. I understand that Russian decision makers are somewhat afraid that Kim Jong-un would sort of recategorize us if we do, if you say exert pressure on North Korea or something, join some international efforts on sanctioning them and cut some supplies and stuff like that. I understand that folks in Moscow are somehow afraid that if they do some hostile steps, then Kim Jong-un will recategorize them and move them closer to the, you know, the bad guys section and towards an open hostile attitude, in which we basically run into we already run into a number of risks if a military situation explodes out there. But this will be even worse, to which I understand Russian defense planners are completely unprepared. So they prefer, this is, if you will, some sort what Russia is doing at the moment is not because they love North Korea or even want to do something bad to the United States, but mostly that they feel like they're hostage of this situation. They don't want this rogue nation to actually turn their eyes on us as the enemy. So Russian supplies are, if you will, a sort of appeasement on the background of a lack of strategy. Really, for all my career, I was not able to actually get a single bit of substance in terms of what strategy Russian government has in this whole North Korea issue, which runs a lot of risk for Russia, practically. So, because all eyes are focused on this, taking control over the former Soviet space and the big global standoff with the United States. So this was considered as one of the side issues to which they have basically no clue how to address. That's my view of this situation.
Thank you. Okay,
Okay.
Sorry.
Many years ago, I was at the Rand Corporation. We used to play war games on North Korea. So I've been to the demilitarized zone, and one thing to know about North Korea, which makes it exceedingly difficult to do anything about it. The ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons could be destroyed in 2 hours, but 15,000 artillery pieces cannot. And then many of them are in the granite mountains that you can see from the zone. They have blast doors, and what that means is that potentially hundreds of thousands, some people say as much as 1 million peaceful South Koreans may die if they unleash a serious artillery barrage, even though these are fairly obsolete weapons, but they work. And they are within range. I'd say half of them are within range of greater Seoul. And if you've been to Seoul, You know, there's 25 million people there. So that's what stops the West, and that's what I think will stop Trump from doing anything, because it's easy to get rid of ballistic missiles and all that, but it's not easy to get rid of the artillery pieces. There are 15,000 of them.
Okay, I did some work on this technical assistance, because the world would all in just couldn't believe that the North Koreans would have achieved such a dramatic progress in the capacity of their vessel, the range and the load that they could carry. So there's a initially it was the SS-18 rocket engine that was supplied, because you could really see on the photograph of the actually the official photograph from North Korean TV that the experts thought that it's those engines, and so they were blaming. The blame game was instantly in place. The Russians blamed the Ukrainians, the Yuzhmash guys, and then all of a sudden, then people dig back into history to sell this. The two private Russian companies were supplying some of those rocket engines, so it was a big cat and mouse game. So, but this is quite relevant. But people really don't understand why we could obliterate and wipe out the sites, anything that is on site, the missiles, everything. It's not the great. It's far more instrumental. A lot of people would die. Okay. I have one more question.
I'm bringing up North Korea. The Russians I know are pretty westernized, and what I see is more people with, I mean, very much like people you find anywhere in the world, Europe and so on. But apparently autocratic regimes survive for a long time without, and despite the economic difficulties and so on. And North Korea is a case in point. So North Korea, despite huge economic difficulties, famine and so on, has survived for 7 years. How do you see the capacity of the Russians to endure in case there is a turn to autocracy? And I had the theory some time ago that when Putin retires, he might appoint Kadyrov or somebody like him to govern. I mean, this is too far-fetched probably, but what is the Russians' capacity to endure difficulties and to sustain the regime? Or you see as a more likely scenario that they will revolt in one form or the other and will topple the regime and will start in a direction of democracy?
Okay, Vlad, one thing more is that a lot of people are watching how the oligarchs would react. Because if you cut their access to capital, if they're forced to pay to be concerned with what their wealth would have, and particularly the wealth that is held in Western banks. So it's just one more dimension, how the oligarchs.
First of all, the oligarchs, Ian, I completely do not believe in any change driven from the inside by the inside circle, because the nature of relationships there have dramatically changed in the past 20 years. Putin had evolved to, like, a big red giant, a superstar, whereas these people have reduced their size to ants or mice, something like that. Because he's been the only figure that both is politically exposed and has the legitimacy. Okay, let's assume that oligarchs have a coup d'etat and appoint somebody. First question that majority of Russians will say, who in the hell this person is? We knew Putin, but this guy. So that new person appointed by the oligarchs will be even less well-known and popular than Navalny is. So that's one problem, but there's even a bigger problem. They're panically afraid to even attempt to organize, because they are being watched 24/7 by the FSB, with one of the key purposes is to try to find out about any plotting and any attempt to influence Putin and so on. And you probably heard about the arrest of one of the regional governors, the Komi Republic, Governor Geyser, a couple of years ago. There is a rumor, but I deem it's quite credible, that actually the furious action that was taken against him and his team, and which was used by his adversaries to promote this idea, is that they were caught somewhere in the sauna in a private conversation actually blaming Putin for a lot of bad stuff happening to the country, and it was like immediately reported, and Putin got mad and ordered them to be arrested the other day, which we do not know if it's true or not, but it sounds extremely credible, and people who I talk to there, they are absolutely panically afraid to even meet a person like me at lunch, because it will be immediately reported upstairs that they're financing the opposition and so on, not to mention organize something. So this is about, and another point about those oligarchs is the nature of those oligarchs have evolved. In '99, they were oligarchs owning private banks and companies. Right now, majority of them are actually owning assets which heavily benefit from working with the state companies. So if they misbehave, you just terminate the contracts, and these folks are nobodies again. That's the nature of. I was sued together with Boris Nemtsov. I was sued by billionaire Timchenko. We had a litigation with him in court, and I do have a lot of knowledge about these folks. And I'm personally convinced that they are not real end beneficiaries of this property. Just to give you an illustration, there was a guy, when there was a powerful mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, and there was a guy who nominally owned huge assets in Moscow, a businessman named Shalva Chigirinsky. He owned the Moscow refinery, the biggest oil asset in the Moscow region, and he owned a lot of development projects and benefited greatly in Lushkov times. But they split, and they had a litigation in London court, where actually Mr. Chigirinsky had testified in court that he was not a real owner of his business, as everybody assumed, but more than 50% de facto was owned by Lushkov family. And there was a sort of a secret agreement on that. I believe that something of that sort exists with these folks. So it's not for philanthropy that Putin generously distributes the contracts between these guys, because they were friends sometimes in the 70s, you know. Not because of that, but because of a different structure of relations. So when you speak about oligarchs, be careful. I mean, sorry, I was talking about this.
It was different,
yeah.
But on the oligarchs, I
yeah.
had the same reading. It was Ilyan's question, but
yeah.
they are not the nominal oligarchs; they are real oligarchs in the Kremlin or somewhere. So the oligarchs.
When it comes to influencing, appointing the governors, when it comes to distributing business contracts, taking over private businesses, yes, they're real oligarchs, but that's their ceiling. When it comes to shaping the future system of power, they're nobodies. That's. Sorry, what was your point? Can you please shortly?
More on the ordinary people, whether they are able to endure difficulties, whether they will comply.
Yeah, I understand. I got it. Sorry, I forgot because that wasn't.
Because in North Korea, you don't see really any change.
Even
though Russia is not North Korea.
We are extremely difficult from North Korea. Extremely. Comparisons hardly are justified. They are really totalitarian society. There is no press. You can't freely move. You can't talk to foreigners. They kill people a lot for disobedience. Not in Russia. In Russia, incumbent governors and mayors lose election. It happens. In Russia, you can speak freely whatever you think about Putin and his oligarchy and, you know, still continue to operate. You get a lot of difficulties, but it's still possible to operate. You do have limited but certain narrow but media internet freedom to a much greater extent than, for instance, you have in China. In China, a real political debate on the internet is forbidden, In Russia, it's limited in scale, but it's possible, and sometimes it breaks out in the open, like happened with Navalny movies and so on. One thing which is a sleeping giant in the room is really this public opinion. Putin's strength is that he was able to keep the public opinion on his side, not on our side. But they are not one, he and the society. Society might turn against him. One of the triggers, and actually this is also reflected not only in the opinion polling in much detail, but also in certain experiences. There is a huge denial in the society of the use of violent force as the means to endure the political domination. Like, to put it simply, people say, okay, we might not like the opposition and might not know who these guys are, but do not beat them up. Do not jail him. This is why Navalny is out of jail at the moment, because when he was put in jail, there was a very serious surge in negativity about that. People don't like if the political opponents are beaten up, killed, or put in jail. This is why they actually try to exercise very targeted repression and violence, not really crossing certain red lines or only doing this in certain exceptional times, because they know that the public will not like repressive regime. Like October 1993, a very clear illustration. Great majority of the people, like in Moscow it was 80%, who said, for Yeltsin, we're against these guys. We want them off the streets with weapons. In Moscow it was like super majority. But when the fight broke up, Yeltsin's ratings immediately went down. Because they say, okay, we support you, but we entrust our support to you on one condition. You settle this whole thing through peaceful means. Once we have civil war on the streets, to hell with you both, right? So Putin knows that. Putin knows that, which is a very important limit to what he can do. And this is why I think this system and these authorities currently exist on buying off society, on brainwashing the society, trying to scare off society with change, which I would dare say is a #1 most effective tool right now. But not mass repression, and definitely we are way too distant, we're worlds apart with North Korea. We're a totally different society.
Okay. Julia, just the final comment on or response to that.
Yeah, actually, Vlad has already told everything, but maybe the only thing that I want to add is that, yeah, Putin knows the point of non-return, and he really knows what he do. But at the same time, when it is when he needs to demonstrate his capacity or his willingness to struggle against corruption or something like that, just to gain some popularity and to sustain his regime, he knows concrete figures that that could be like a red light for the people when they could see, oh yeah, sure, so he did some bad deeds, he's really corrupted and so on, he's arrested and all these procedures, but then when the need to when there is no longer need to make people concentrated on on certain things and just to be on the mainstream, he released this person. Or no, for example, in Russia it was possible to maintain the protests that were backed up by the open society or front, the Open Russia, which is backed up by Khodorkovsky. It is still possible in Russia. Nobody is jailed, but okay, if you want, you can, but know your limits as well as I will know mine.
in nature. Okay, at this point we should round up and close this very interesting rendezvous with Vlad and Yulia. I just want to thank them very much for taking the time to come over here, and I'm very convinced that in order to understand what is happening in Bulgaria, you have to read in what's happening in Russia, because the model is essentially the same. You have a lot of caveats that probably would pertain on Bulgaria being a member of the EU and NATO, but essentially, if you look at the elites, they're copy-pastes. Well, I don't usually like the word mafia, because mafia is oversimplified. You don't get into the details. Once you don't get into the details, you cannot design a proper policy or a proper sort of countermeasures. And that's essential for us to keep a line and channels of communication with the Russian opposition, because the wisdom and the knowledge they could bring it to us, and we could sort of exchange and share. For example, one thing, if you noted on the lessons they've learned in trying to fight off Putinism, are priceless, because you cannot distill. For example, we find it very difficult to organize. People are absolutely unhappy, but you can't take out on the streets more than 1,000 people or 1,500. It's a big thing. So there has to be a way around it. And particularly in the energy sector, just what Vlad told you about Rosatom and everything, that would tell you a lot on one thing. We at the moment, we're trying to make some sort of way out of this doldrum, because we're stuck with having equipment and reactors. We don't need them because there's no place for 2,000 megawatts of new nuclear capacity. It's well beyond the white elephant. And yet, this is what I was preaching, that, listen, Rosatom don't have the cash to produce all the generators, all the reactors that they own on the list. So the notion that we cannot sell those reactors or co-invest with them in a third country, or use as even the Chinese were interested, is nonsense. Somebody wants to play the old tune. Super. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, one big round of applause, Alex, Vlad, and you. And Vasco at the back. Thank you.